dialogue with Muslims has existed in the past, it does exist at the present time, and should exist in the future. So now, if you bear with me, I will say something about this dialogue which has taken place and therefore can take place. I want to give some examples, in particular between Christians and Muslims, but the dialogue also takes place at a multilateral level. I'm going to follow the fourfold typology of dialogue given in the documents of the Council for Interreligious Dialogue: dialogue of life, dialogue of action, dialogue of discourse, dialogue of spiritual experience, or religious experience. The dialogue of life, or what I like to call harmonious living, takes place, and I quote, where people strive to live in an open and neighbourly spirit, sharing their joys and sorrows, their human problems and preoccupations. Now, Christians and Muslims have been living side by side for centuries in some parts of the world. In the Middle East, in the Indian subcontinent, in Southeast Asia, in many parts of Africa. In other words, in all those regions where Islam has long been established. Elsewhere, in countries of Western Europe, here in the US, in Canada, also in Australia, the relatively recent immigration of Muslims has created opportunities for the dialogue of life. I want to underline a word in that definition that was given, where people strive to live in an open and neighbourly spirit. Strive. We have to emphasize that. An effort is required to establish positive relations between Christians and Muslims, because it is quite easy to live side by side without any interaction. The minority living in a ghetto, not necessarily imposed on them, but adopted by them, and more or less ignored by the majority. Just one little example. Sometimes in Cairo, I would want to go and visit a mosque or something, or take people to visit Al-Azhar, and I'd ask the driver to take me. The driver was a Christian. He would park the car outside the mosque, a diplomatic car, so we could park in places where you don't normally park, and he would stay outside. Christian, born and bred in Egypt, he has never been into a mosque. Why should he go into a mosque? There's no interest, there's no purpose in going into a mosque. It doesn't understand us strangers who want to see and look at these things, and that is fairly typical. So you have to make an effort to establish relations. One of the first actions that was taken by what was then the Secretariat for Non-Christians was to send greetings to Muslims at the end of Ramadan for the Eid al-Fitr. This message, which is an annual message then at the end of Ramadan, is usually signed by the President, but as you may know, Pope Francis signed the message himself in the first year of his pontificate, just to show that it is important for the Holy See, for the Pope, to be in relation with different Muslims. I was interested to see that some Muslims are promoting the program Muslims for Lent. I don't know if you've seen that. It's interesting. The Muslims are joining Christians in giving up something during this period of Lent. It's a way of showing an interest and a concern for members of the other community. And this, of course, can be done in other ways by being present at various ceremonies. It might be baptism, or it might be the circumcision of a child, being present at weddings, or in particular at funerals. Of course, in many parts of the world, the social climate is not conducive to good relations between Christians and Muslims. The effects of 9/11 are still being felt, producing an attitude of suspicion towards Muslims in general. And on the other hand, the invasion of Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the lack of resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict continue to stoke the fires of resentment of Muslims, particularly in the Arab world, towards the West, and the West is identified with the Christian world. And Christians, for their part, point to the violence against their fellow believers in Iraq and Syria, the recent slaughter of the Coptic workers in Libya, the continuous attacks of Boko Haram in Nigeria. Added to these, the killings in Paris, in Copenhagen, but also the murder of Muslims in Chapel Hill. Such events lead many people to question whether there is any future for Christian-Muslim dialogue. Well, to my mind, this violence only increases the need for dialogue. There must be a readiness to start all over again when, for some reason or other, relations have been broken. Let me turn to the dialogue of action, because harmonious living may lead quite naturally to actions undertaken in common. In certain countries, Christians and Muslims are working together to face up to problems of society. And in the UK, I think this is we see the involvement of Muslims in basically Christian pro-life movements. I don't know whether that is so here in the States. Also, instances of Christians and Muslims engaging together in movements advocating human rights, social reforms, or care of the environment. There have been reports from various countries of Africa of mutual assistance given by Christians and Muslims in the building of a new mosque in a village or a new chapel or church. So everybody coming together. These are examples of sporadic cooperation, but there can also be a more permanent type of cooperation, which really deserves the name of dialogue of action. In Tunisia, for example, Christians and Muslims have collaborated to form associations dedicated to the care of the handicapped. Religions for Peace, I don't know if you know this, it was the World Conference of Religions for Peace, but Religions for Peace, an international body, which has its secretariat in New York, has in different countries involved religious communities, including Muslims, in common action to prevent the spread of AIDS or to help the victims of this pandemic. And in a number of regions of the world, this organization of Religions for Peace has been instrumental in forming interreligious councils. And on occasion, these representatives of these interreligious councils have acted as mediators in trying to overcome sectarian conflicts. I want to mention here two initiatives promoted by the present Sheikh al-Azhar, Dr. Ahmed al-Tayyib. The first is called the Bayt al-Aila, the House of the Family. He has created a forum for religious leaders in Egypt in order to work together to counteract sectarian violence. There are always violent outbreaks in Egypt where Christians and Muslims are living together, and for all different sorts of reasons, not usually religious reasons, but the conflict very quickly becomes religious. And so he's brought together bishops of the different churches in Egypt and Muslim leaders together to work together, to examine together how they can counteract this tendency towards sectarian violence. And within that, there's the second initiative, is to hold meetings for imams and priests. And what I found interesting about this meeting of imams and priests was you didn't have the imams on one side and the priests on the other side facing one another, two opposing teams. No, they were all mixed up, and they were given work to do in twos or threes or little clusters, that they had to work together. And that is so important, that they had to understand one another, they had to produce results together. And there's an interesting story about, at the end of one of these meetings, priest and imam were going back to their residences, and they were traveling together in a public taxi, a microbus they call them in Egypt, where lots of people there. And the imam and the priest were talking away, they were continuing their conversation, and the priest got off first. And as soon as the priest had alighted, all the people attacked the imam and said, "Why are you talking to this priest? You shouldn't be talking to him. You shouldn't have any relations with the priest." And so the imam had to defend himself, saying, "No, we have to do this." It's very interesting. And I think that the bringing of religious leaders together in that way and bringing them to cooperate at a local level is in fact most important. Cooperating is a form of dialogue. You have to discuss what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, who is going to be responsible. All that takes a lot of dialogue. And so there is really a dialogue of action. But what we think of dialogue is, I think, usually the dialogue of discourse, where specialists seek to deepen their understanding of their respective religious heritages and to appreciate each other's spiritual values. So the focus is on formal meetings. These are not necessarily theological. They can be on topics that are ethical or social in nature. Let me give you some of the topics that have been discussed by the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue with various Muslim bodies. International trade relations, justice in international trade relations, business ethics, problems of migration, media and religion, respect for the environment, questions of bioethics. These have all been taken up with various Muslim groups. Women in society, we had a very stormy meeting on women in society with a Jordanian group. The unfortunate thing is that we don't know whether these groups continue. The Al-Bayt Foundation in Jordan has changed its orientation in some ways, though it has come back to dialogue with Christians too. The World Islamic Call Society, based in Tripoli, I don't know whether it still exists in the chaos that is Libya at the moment. Certainly the Iranian Center for Cultural Dialogue continues, and I must say that there is a very fruitful dialogue with Shia. Usually the dialogue has not been theological, but after the speech of Pope Benedict XVI in Regensburg, there was a reaction on the part of Muslims, and they called for theological dialogue. And this has led to the Common Word initiative. From the Vatican side, there have been two meetings, one in the Vatican in November 2008, Love of God and Love of Neighbor, and a second meeting in 2011 at the site of the baptism of Jesus in Jordan, Reason, Faith and the Human Person. But there were also other meetings, a meeting in 2008 at Yale University, which discussed the unity of God, Jesus Christ and his passion, and the love of God. And in the United Kingdom at Lambeth Palace and at Cambridge University, where they talked about the understanding of Scripture, shared moral values, respect for foundational figures, religious freedom, religiously motivated violence. So there was a combination of theological questions and practical issues. These have been dialogue, I would say, at international level, but dialogues go on at the regional level also. And in the US there have been 3 dialogues, one the Mid-Atlantic group, the Midwest, and the, which is the other group? The West Coast. Each of these groups has a Catholic bishop and a member of an Islamic organization as the chairpersons in the meeting. And if you want to know more about that, consult the chapter by John Borelli, Recent Muslim Catholic Dialogue in the USA, in a book that we produced together, Interfaith Dialogue, A Catholic View. I bear with me, I mention another program, the Building Bridges program. This was an Anglican initiative started by Lord Carey when he was Archbishop of Canterbury. I mention it because it has a particular feature, which is that within the meeting there is a careful reading of passages from the Bible and the Quran. Perhaps this is through the influence of Professor David Ford of Cambridge University, who is a leading participant in scriptural reasoning. So I took part in one of these meetings where selected passages from the Quran were presented by Muslim participants, and passages from the Hebrew Scriptures or the New Testament were presented by Christians. I was asked to introduce the prologue from St. John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, the Word was made flesh. Not an easy passage. But I found it interesting the way this passage, with its strong insistence on the incarnation, was respectfully listened to by the Muslims in the group. And I think that this is a very powerful and fruitful way of engaging in dialogue. You're not discussing, you're exchanging, you're experiencing also. I've mentioned the Shia, and so there is also an ongoing dialogue with the Shia Muslims. And I would say that the Shia of Iran have a strong philosophical tradition behind them, and this gives a strength to the dialogue with them. They are, I would say, much more curious about Christianity, and they've translated everything and than their counterparts in the Arab world, at least. It's the Shia Muslims in Qum who have translated the Catholic Catechism of the Church. They translated it into Farsi, and they went to the Lebanon to find out how the Arab Christians who had translated this work, what technical terms they used, because there is similarity between the Farsi and the Arabic with regard to religious vocabulary. And they submitted their manuscript, their translation, to the Catholic bishop in Tehran to see if he approved of it. He was delighted. He said, we could never do that. We could never have translated this book. They have done it themselves. This is wonderful. Do I have time? Just the dialogue of religious experience. It's described, what is it? Where persons rooted in their own religious traditions share their spiritual riches, for instance, with regard to prayer and contemplation, faith and ways of searching for God or the Absolute. I just want to give one example. In 1979, in Algeria, a number of religious men and women decided to help one another to live their vocation within Islamic society by a constant reference to Islamic spirituality. So they would select a theme which each one would follow up personally in the scriptures and in the Quran or other Islamic sources. And once or twice a year they would come together, usually at the Trappist monastery of Notre-Dame de l'Atlas in Tiberine, to share their findings and then to select another theme. Some members of the Alawi confraternity, a Sufi body living in the city of Media nearby, near the monastery, asked to join them. And eventually these Muslims became full members of what is known as the Ribat as-Salam, the bond of peace. The prior of the Trappist monastery, Notre-Dame de l'Atlas, Father Christian de Chergé, had studied at the Pontifical Institute of Arabic and Islamic Studies in Rome, and had been leading his community, not without some initial resistance, into a deeper knowledge and respect for the Islamic spiritual tradition. Although, as you know, 7 of the monks, included Father Christian, were kidnapped and killed, the Ribat has continued its activities, though not necessarily in Tiberine. Here are some of the themes that they have chosen to explore both in the Christian and the Islamic traditions. Act justly and walk humbly with your God. How does God invite us to humility? Live in a spirit of thanksgiving. Compassion, the language of the heart. Compassion extended to the whole of creation. Hospitality as a fruit of compassion. Together to pray and build a world of justice and peace. I think these are themes that unite Christians and Muslims around the world. To conclude, but I have 3 pages of conclusions. Christian-Muslim dialogue exists, and so it's possible. Obviously, the situation is uneven. There are places where there is little or no interest in this dialogue. There are places where relations with Muslim neighbours have become a normal concern for Christian communities. And it's true, I think, that meetings of religious leaders take place more frequently, and leaders are ready to make common statements together and to act together when occasions arise. You know that when there was this killing in Paris, at that very time, that very day, there was a delegation of bishops and imams were being received by Pope Francis in Rome, and they made a common statement together. Another difficulty is a lack of knowledge. When one considers populations as a whole and not just the elite, one is struck by reciprocal ignorance. There is indeed much ignorance in the West about Islam, but there is also much ignorance about Christianity in countries with a Christian majority. And so there's a constant need to educate people, conveying the true image of Islam, as many Muslims advocate, but also, I would say, revealing the true nature of Christianity. Motivations for dialogue are often more social than religious, community cohesion being considered more important than growth in religious understanding. And this opens the way for more political interference in religious relations, because governments are interested in promoting a dialogue of civilizations or an alliance of civilizations as a countermeasure to the threat of a clash of civilizations. So people would say, well, what can interreligious dialogue do in a world of conflict? Well, what can it not do? I think interreligious dialogue should not be expected to bring an immediate solution to a conflict situation. Dialogue is not a fire brigade. It can't be called in to put out a conflagration. When war is raging, there is usually little possibility of conducting dialogue, because the necessary conditions of dialogue, equality, trust, openness, are generally not present. People are not inclined to listen to one another, and so the solution to these conflicts has to come from a different angle, from political negotiations. Of course, religious leaders can help there. They can encourage people to support the solution, particularly if they have relations on the other side. And we have seen this, for instance, in the Republic of Central Africa, imam and bishops going around together to encourage people to not to fight, but to come together. Interreligious dialogue, I would say, is more in the nature of preventive medicine than curative. Its aim is to build up good relations among people of different religions, to help them to live in peace and harmony, so that if outside influences come in which attack this harmony, they will resist, because they are strengthened together. Of course, where there is conflict, where there has been conflict, there needs to be a purification of memories, listening to differing accounts of the same events. Maybe need to demythologize, so that the past is not continuously used as a weapon to arouse hatred and enmity. And also honesty, seeing that things are not just black and white. There can be wrongs on both sides. And anyway, to acknowledge wrongs done, injustices, atrocities. This is always an important step in the process of reconciliation. John Paul II, in one of his messages for the Day of Peace, said, "There can be no peace without justice, no justice without forgiveness." And we know how difficult that is. A serious effort is required to understand the other religion as it presents itself. There may be a temptation to fasten only upon that which appears to be common, and we take individual elements out of their context, neglecting the inner logic of each tradition, which gives it its own specificity. It's good to underline commonalities, but there shouldn't be any fear of differences. True understanding will develop when people rooted in their own tradition open themselves up to the riches of other traditions. Religions provide motivation. That's why it's important for different religions to tackle problems together. And yet, a word of caution. What is being proposed is not an alliance of religions against the rest. The spirit of dialogue has to be fostered within each individual religious tradition, among the religious traditions, and between people with a religious bent and those of a secular mentality. Interreligious dialogue should lead to a common search for understanding, a shared sympathy for those who are suffering and in need, to a thirst for justice for all, to forgiveness for wrong done, together with a readiness to acknowledge one's own wrongdoings, whether individual or collective. True religion, relayed by interreligious dialogue, does not support conflict and war, but provides the right atmosphere in which conflicts can be resolved and peace attained. And to my mind, that is the true way forward for Christian-Muslim dialogue. Thank you.